Hello everyone, welcome back to Tieu Nu Stories. Tonight's tale will take you on an emotional storm, a story of love, loss, and the fragile line between hope and despair. Before we begin, don't forget to hit subscribe. Let's reach 10,000 followers so we can continue sharing these beautiful stories together. On a dark and stormy night, lightning flashed across the sky as Tieu Nu wandered the empty streets alone. Her thin raincoat clung to her trembling body, but she didn't care. In her hands was a soaked flyer, a photo of Truong, the man who once promised to never leave her. He had disappeared without a trace. Days turned into weeks, and the silence grew heavier than the rain pouring over her. Still, she refused to give up. "You told me to wait, so I will," she whispered, her voice drowned by thunder. Every corner she turned, she looked for him, in strangers' faces, in reflections, in shadows cast by passing cars. Yet the only answer she received was the cold wind that lashed against her cheeks. Exhausted but determined, Tieu Nu decided to print hundreds of flyers. If fate won't bring him back, maybe someone else will, she thought. Her hands trembled as she paid the shopkeeper, clutching the warm stack of paper like it was her last piece of hope. When she stepped outside, the rain still poured, relentless, almost punishing. She began pasting the posters across lampposts and walls, her movement steady but her heart trembling. Each piece of paper fluttered in the wind like a silent cry. "Truong, where are you?" Yet, just as she was about to place the final flyer, a shadow passed behind her. A tall figure, familiar shoulders, a voice in the distance, soft, uncertain. Could it be him? Or just another illusion born from too much longing? The rain intensified, drumming violently on the rooftops as Tieu Nu froze in place. Her breath quickened, her fingers still holding the half-folded flyer. That silhouette, tall, slightly hunched under the dim streetlight, looked so much like Truong. Her heart began to pound wildly. "Truong!" she shouted, her voice barely cutting through the roar of the storm. The figure stopped for just a moment. Tieu Nu's pulse spiked. She ran forward, her shoes splashing through puddles, cold water soaking her legs. "Wait, please, turn around." But when she reached the end of the street, the man had vanished into the crowd of umbrellas. Her chest tightened painfully. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe she wanted to believe too much. Tieu Nu leaned against a wall, panting, drenched from head to toe. She looked down at the flyer in her trembling hands. Truong's face, smiling faintly, printed in black and white. "I'll find you," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Determined, once again, she continued to post the flyers around the city. Walls, shop doors, telephone poles, everywhere she could reach. The ink began to run from the rain, but she didn't care. To her, each poster was a promise, a fragment of her love scattered across the streets. People passed by, glancing at her curiously. Some offered pity, others just ignored her. A young woman stopped briefly, saying softly, "You really love him, don't you?" Tieu Nu smiled weakly, her eyes red. "He's all I have left." Hours later, exhaustion finally caught up. She took shelter under a small canopy beside a closed cafe. Her hands were raw from the tape, her knees shaking. She sat down, hugging her backpack close. Inside were just a few soggy flyers and the last bit of hope she carried. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the street. For a second, she thought she saw him across the road, standing still, watching her. Her breath hitched. Truong? The figure took one hesitant step forward, then disappeared behind the passing headlights. Her tears mixed with the rain as she whispered, "If that's really you, please don't disappear again." The storm raged on, but deep inside, something had shifted. A spark of destiny flickered. The storm continued through the night, relentless and cold. Tieu Nu couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the sidewalk, her hair plastered to her face, staring at the last flyer in her hand. The streetlight shimmered in puddles, and every reflection looked like his face. There, then gone again. When dawn finally came, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds. She gathered the remaining posters and started walking again. Her shoes squelched with every step, but she didn't care. She had one goal: find Truong, no matter what it took. At a small corner shop, an old man stopped her. "Girl," he said, pointing to the flyer in her hand, "I've seen that man." Her heart skipped a beat. "Where? Please tell me where." The old man frowned, thinking. A few nights ago, by the old bus station, he looked troubled, like he was running from something. Tieu Nu's fingers tightened around the paper. "Running?" "Yes," he said quietly, and he wasn't alone. 2 men were following him. Her blood ran cold. The words echoed in her mind. 2 men following him. Without a second thought, she ran toward the bus station. Her legs ached, her lungs burned, but fear pushed her forward. When she arrived, the place was almost empty, just puddles, broken lights, and the faint smell of fuel. She looked around desperately. Then she saw it. A torn piece of fabric caught on a metal railing. It was the same color as Truong's jacket. She ran to it, her hands trembling as she picked it up. "Truong!" Suddenly, a man's voice behind her made her freeze. "Are you looking for someone?" She turned sharply. A stranger in a dark raincoat stood a few feet away, his face shadowed by his hat. "Yes," she stammered. "My friend, he's missing." The man's smile was cold. "Maybe you should stop looking. Some people disappear for a reason." A chill ran down her spine. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The man you're searching for, Truong, he's involved in something dangerous. You'd better go home before you get hurt." Tieu Nu's hands clenched. "You're lying." But the man only smirked and walked away, disappearing into the fog like a phantom. Tieu Nu's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She sank to her knees, gripping the torn fabric to her chest. "No, I don't believe it," she whispered. "Truong wouldn't do something like that." As she stood again, the wind picked up, blowing one of her posters across the ground. She bent to catch it, and at that moment a car screeched to a halt nearby. A hand opened the door, and there he was. Truong. His face was pale, his eyes tired but alive. "Tieu Nu," he said weakly, before collapsing into her arms. The world fell silent. The rain stopped. She held him close, her tears falling freely. "Don't leave me again," she whispered. "Please, not this time." The world around them blurred as Tieu Nu held Truong tightly, her heart racing. His body was cold and heavy in her arms, his breathing shallow. The rain had eased into a thin drizzle, but her tears still streamed down, mixing with the water on his face. "Truong, please, open your eyes," she cried, shaking him gently. His lips moved weakly, murmuring something she couldn't catch. She leaned closer, desperate to hear. "Run," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They're still following me." Her stomach dropped. She looked around. The empty streets, the flickering lights, the sound of distant footsteps echoing faintly through the fog. Her instinct screamed danger. "No, I won't leave you," she said firmly, pulling him closer. "You're safe now. I've found you." But Truong's hand gripped her wrist weakly, his eyes pleading. "You don't understand. They'll hurt you too." Before she could respond, the screech of tires tore through the air. A black car skidded to a stop at the end of the street. Two men in dark coats jumped out, shouting something she couldn't make out. Tieu Nu froze for half a second, then everything in her screamed run. She pulled Truong up with all her strength, half dragging, half carrying him into a narrow alleyway. Her shoes splashed through puddles, her breath ragged. Behind them, the men yelled and gave chase. She darted left, then right, weaving through the maze of alleyways, clutching Truong's arm as his weight leaned heavily against her. "Just a little further," she whispered. "Please, hold on." They stumbled into an old abandoned warehouse, its broken windows creaking in the wind. She shut the rusty door behind them, pressing her back against it, panting. Truong slid to the ground, coughing weakly. His face was pale as paper. "Tieu Nu," he gasped. "I didn't disappear. I was forced to." Her eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" He took a shaky breath. "There was a deal, something I shouldn't have been part of. I was trying to help a friend, but it went wrong. They thought I had evidence. They've been after me ever since." Tieu Nu's mind reeled. "Then why didn't you tell me? Why did you leave me alone?" His eyes filled with pain. "Because they threatened you. They said if I didn't disappear, they'd find you first." Tieu Nu's heart broke. All the sleepless nights, all the wandering in the rain, all because he was protecting her. She grabbed his hand tightly. "You shouldn't have faced it alone. We could have found a way, together." Truong managed a faint smile. "You always say that." She wiped her tears quickly. "We need to get you to a hospital. You're burning up." But as she reached for her phone, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the warehouse. Her blood ran cold. "They found us." Truong tried to stand, but pain shot through him. "Go," he said, his voice breaking. "You still have time." Tieu Nu shook her head fiercely. "No, I'm not leaving you again." The door burst open. A man stepped inside, the same one who had warned her at the bus station. He sneered. "I told you, some people disappear for a reason." Tieu Nu stepped in front of Truong, spreading her arms. "You'll have to go through me first." The man's smirk faltered. "You don't know what you're getting into." "Maybe not," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "But I know what love means. It means not running away." A tense silence hung in the air, then sirens, loud and near. The men outside began to scatter. Police lights flashed through the cracks in the window. The man cursed under his breath and bolted. Tieu Nu sank to the floor beside Truong, trembling with relief. As the officers stormed in, Truong looked at her with glassy eyes and whispered, "You found me, even when I was lost." She smiled through tears. "And I'll find you again, no matter where you go." Days later, the storm had passed. The city, once drenched in chaos, now bathed in the soft light of dawn. Inside a quiet hospital room, Tieu Nu sat beside Truong's bed, her fingers gently brushing his hand. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the sweetest sound she'd heard in weeks. Truong stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. When his gaze met hers, a weak smile crossed his face. "You're still here," he murmured. "Of course I am." She replied softly, "I told you I'd never leave again." He tried to speak, but emotion caught in his throat. "I thought I lost everything until I saw you standing there." Tieu Nu's eyes glistened. "You didn't lose me. You never will." Outside the window, sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting their faces in gold. For the first time in months, peace replaced the fear that had haunted them. A gentle knock on the door interrupted the moment. A police officer entered, nodding politely. "The men who chased you have been arrested. You're safe now." Tieu Nu let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Safe. The word felt unreal. After the officer left, Truong turned toward her. "You risked everything for me, even when I wasn't sure I deserved it." She shook her head, her voice tender but firm. "You don't have to deserve love, Truong. You just have to accept it." He smiled faintly, squeezing her hand. "Then let me start by saying, thank you for finding me, for believing in me, even when the world didn't." Tieu Nu leaned closer, resting her forehead against his. "You don't have to thank me. Just promise me one thing, no more running." He nodded, his voice steady this time. "No more running." The clock ticked softly. Outside, children's laughter floated up from the street, mingling with the rustle of the wind. As the sun climbed higher, Truong whispered, "Maybe everything that happened was fate, so we could find each other again." Tieu Nu smiled, tears glimmering like morning dew. Maybe it was. In that quiet moment, surrounded by sunlight and serenity, they both knew the hardest part was over, and love had finally found its way home.
Sau bao nhiêu ngày mưa gió tuyệt vọng, tỷ nữ cuối cùng cũng tìm thấy Truong, người đàn ông cô yêu sau khi anh mất tích bí ẩn. Nhưng niềm vui đoàn tụ nhanh chóng biến thành nỗi kinh hồn khi cô phát hiện anh bị truy đuổi bởi một nhóm người nguy hiểm. Truong ngất xỉu trong vòng tay cô, để cô, rồi cả hai phải trốn chạy giữa màn đêm, giữa mưa sợ hãi. Dù biết có thể nguy hiểm, tiểu nữ vẫn kiên quyết không rời bỏ anh. Cuối cùng, nhờ sự can thiệp của cảnh sát, Truong đã được cứu. Trong bệnh viện, anh tỉnh dậy, nắm chặt tay cô, hứa sẽ không bao giờ rời xa nữa. Giữa ánh nắng bình minh, họ mỉm cười, tình yêu đã được tìm đường trở về.